The Bay of Pigs invasion, known in Latin America as Invasio Cubana de Baja de Cochinos, was a failed military invasion of Cuba undertaken by the CIA-sponsored paramilitary group Brigade 2506 on April 17, 1961. A counter-revolutionary military, trained and funded by the United States government's Central Intelligence Agency, Brigade 2506 fronted the armed wing of the Democratic Revolutionary Front and intended to overthrow the revolutionary left-wing government of Fidel Castro. Launched from Guatemala, the invading force was defeated within 3 days by the Cuban armed forces, under the direct command of Prime Minister Fidel Castro. The Cuban Revolution of 1949 to 1959 had seen President Fulgencio Batista, a right-wing ally of the U.S., ousted. He was replaced by a new left-wing administration dominated by Castro, which had severed the country's formerly strong links with the U.S. by expropriating their economic assets and developing links with the Soviet Union, with whom the U.S. was then embroiled in the Cold War. The U.S. government of President Dwight D. Eisenhower was concerned at the direction which Castro's government was taking, and in March 1960, Eisenhower allocated $13.1 million to the CIA in order to plan Castro's overthrow. The CIA proceeded to organize the operation with the aid of various Cuban counter-revolutionary forces, training Brigade 2506 in Mexico. Following his election in 1960, President John F. Kennedy was informed of the invasion plan and gave his consent. Over 1,400 paramilitaries, divided into 5 infantry battalions and 1 paratrooper battalion, assembled in Guatemala before setting out for Cuba by boat on April 13. On April 15, 8 CIA-supplied B-26 bombers attacked Cuban airfields and returned to the U.S. On the night of April 16, the main invasion landed at a beach named Playa Guerra Cubana in the Bay of Pigs. It initially overwhelmed a local revolutionary militia. The Cuban Army's counter-offensive was led by Captain Jose Copyright Rama Cuban Fernandez, before Castro decided to take personal control of the operation. On April 20, the invaders finally surrendered, with the majority of troops being publicly interrogated and then sent back to the U.S. The failed invasion strengthened the position of Castro's administration, who proceeded to openly proclaim their intention to adopt socialism and strengthen ties with the Soviet Union. This led eventually to the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The invasion was a major embarrassment for U.S. foreign policy. John Kennedy ordered a number of internal investigations. Across Latin America, it is celebrated as evidence of the fallibility of U.S. imperialism. Background: Cuba was for centuries a part of the Spanish Empire. In the late 19th century, Cuban nationalist revolutionaries rebelled against Spanish dominance, resulting in 3 liberation wars, the 10 Years' War, the Little War and the Cuban War of Independence. Interested in extending its hegemony over Cuba, the crown jewel of the Spanish colonial empire, as a colony, the United States government proclaimed war on the Spanish Empire, resulting in the Spanish-American War. The U.S. subsequently invaded the island, and forced the Spanish army out. On May 20, 1902, a new independent government proclaimed the foundation of the Republic of Cuba, with U.S. military Governor Leonard Wood handing over control to President Tomás Estrada Palma, a Cuban-born American citizen. Subsequently, large numbers of U.S. settlers and businessmen arrived in Cuba, and by 1905, 60% of rural properties were owned by non-Cuban North Americans. Between 1906 and 1909, 5,000 U.S. Marines were stationed across the island, and returned in 1912, 1917 and 1921 to intervene in internal affairs, sometimes at the behest of the Cuban government. Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. In March 1952, a Cuban general and politician, Fulgencio Batista, seized power on the island, proclaimed himself president and deposed the discredited President Carlos Prado Socarrás of the Partido Auto Copyright NTICO. Batista cancelled the planned presidential elections, and described his new system as disciplined democracy. Although he gained some popular support, many Cubans saw it as the establishment of a one-man dictatorship. Many opponents of the Batista regime took to armed rebellion in an attempt to oust the government, sparking the Cuban Revolution. One of these groups was the National Revolutionary Movement, a militant organization containing largely middle-class members which had been founded by the professor of philosophy Rafael Garca Baracena. Another was the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, which had been founded by the Federation of University Students President Jose Copyright Antonio Echevarría. However, the best-known of these anti-Batista groups was the 26th of July movement, founded by a lawyer named Fidel Castro. Consisting of both a civil and a military committee, the former conducted political agitation through an underground newspaper while the latter armed and trained recruits to take violent action against Batista. With Castro as the Mr. 26-7's head, the organization was based upon a clandestine cell system, with each cell containing 10 members, none of whom knew the whereabouts or activities of the other cells. Between December 1956 and 1959, Castro led a guerrilla army against the forces of Batista from his base camp in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. The Batista's repression of revolutionaries had earned him widespread unpopularity, and by 1958, his armies were in retreat. On December 31, 1958, Batista resigned, and fled into exile, taking with him an amassed fortune of more than $300 million. The presidency fell to Castro's chosen candidate, the lawyer Manuel Urrutia, while members of the Mr. 26-7 took control of most positions in the cabinet. On February 16, 1959, Castro himself took on the role of prime minister. Dismissing the need for elections, Castro proclaimed the new administration to be an example of direct democracy, in which the Cuban populace could assemble en masse at demonstrations and express their democratic will to him personally. Critics instead condemned the new regime as undemocratic. The counter-revolution, soon after the success of the Cuban Revolution, militant counter-revolutionary groups developed in an attempt to overthrow the new regime. Undertaking armed attacks against government forces, some set up guerrilla bases in Cuba's mountainous regions, leading to the 6-year war against the bandits. These dissidents were funded and armed by various foreign sources, including the exiled Cuban community, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, and the Dominican government of General Rafael Trujillo. No quarter was given during the suppression of the resistance in the Escambray Mountains, where former rebels from the war against Batista took different sides. On April 3, 1961, a bomb attack on militia barracks in Bayamo killed 4 militia, and wounded 8 more. On April 6, the Hershey Sugar Factory in Matanzas was destroyed by sabotage. On April 14, 1961, guerrillas led by Agapito Rivera fought Cuban government forces near Las Cruces, Montembo, Las Villas, where several government troops were killed and others wounded. Also on April 14, 1961, a Cubana airliner was hijacked and flown to Jacksonville, Florida. Resultant confusion then helped discovery of the staged defection of a B-26 and piloted Miami on April 15. Castro's government began a crackdown on this opposition movement, arresting hundreds of dissidents. Although it rejected the methods of physical torture which had been employed by Batista's regime, Castro's government sanctioned the use of psychological torture, subjecting some prisoners to solitary confinement, rough treatment, hunger and threatening behavior. After conservative editors and journalists began expressing hostility towards the government following its leftward turn, the pro-Castro Printers Trade Union began to harass and disrupt editorial staff. In January 1960 the government proclaimed that each newspaper would be obliged to publish a clarification written by the Printers Union to the end of any articles which were critical of the government. This would prove to be the start of press censorship in Castro's Cuba. Popular uproar across Cuba demanded that those figures who had been complicit in the widespread torture and killing of civilians be brought to justice. Although he remained a moderating force and tried to prevent the mass reprisal killings of Batistanos advocated by many Cubans, Castro helped to set up trials of many figures involved in the old regime across the country, resulting in hundreds of executions. Although widely popular in Cuba, critics, in particular from the U.S. press, argued that many of these did not meet the standards of a fair trial, and condemned Cuba's new government as being more interested in vengeance than justice. Castro retaliated strongly against such accusations, proclaiming that revolutionary justice is not based on legal precepts, but on moral conviction. In a show of support for this revolutionary justice, he organized the first Havana trial to take place before a mass audience of 17,000 at the Sports Palace Stadium. When a group of aviators accused of bombing a village were found not guilty, he ordered a retrial in which they were instead found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. On March 11, 1961, Jesus Carreras and American William Alexander Morgan were executed after a trial. Tensions with the United States. Castro's Cuban government ordered the country's oil refineries then controlled by the U.S. corporations Shell, Esso and Standard Oil to process crude oil purchased from the Soviet Union, but under pressure from the U.S. government, these companies refused. Castro responded by expropriating the refineries and nationalizing them under state control. In retaliation, the U.S. canceled its import of Cuban sugar, provoking Castro to nationalize most U.S.-owned assets on the island, including banks and sugar mills. Relations between Cuba and the U.S. were further strained following the explosion and sinking of a French vessel, the Le Cabre, in Havana harbor in March 1960. Carrying weapons purchased from Belgium, the cause of the explosion was never determined, but Castro publicly insinuated that the U.S. government were guilty of sabotage. On October 13, 1960, the U.S. government then prohibited the majority of exports to Cuba, the exceptions being medicines and certain foodstuffs, marking the start of an economic embargo. In retaliation, the Cuban National Institute for Agrarian Reform took control of 383 private-run businesses on October 14, and on October 25 a further 166 U.S. companies operating in Cuba had their premises seized and nationalized, including Coca-Cola and Sears Roebuck. On December 16, the U.S. then ended its import quota of Cuban sugar, the country's primary export. The U.S. government was becoming increasingly critical of the direction which Castro's revolutionary government was taking Cuba. At an August 1960 meeting of the Organization of American States held in Costa Rica, the U.S. Secretary of State Christian Herter publicly proclaimed that Castro's regime was following faithfully the Bolshevik pattern by instituting a single-party political system, taking governmental control of trade unions, suppressing civil liberties, and removing both the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. He furthermore asserted that international communism was using Cuba as an operational base for spreading revolution in the Western Hemisphere, and called on other OAS members to condemn the Cuban government for its breach of human rights. In turn, Castro lambasted the treatment of black people and the working classes which he had witnessed in New York City, which he lampooned as that super-free, super-democratic, super-humane, and super-civilized city. Proclaiming that the American poor were living in the bowels of the imperialist monster, he attacked the mainstream U.S. media for being controlled by big business. Preparation, early plans. The idea of overthrowing Castro's administration first emerged within the Central Intelligence Agency, an independent civilian intelligence agency of the United States government, in early 1960. Founded in 1947 by the National Security Act, the CIA was a product of the Cold War, having been designed to counter the espionage activities of the Soviet Union's own National Security Agency, the KGB. As the perceived threat of international communism grew larger, the CIA expanded its activities to undertake covert economic, political and military activities that would advance causes favorable to U.S. interests. The CIA's director at the time, Allen Dulles, was responsible for overseeing clandestine operations across the world, and although widely considered an ineffectual administrator, he was popular among his employees, whom he had protected from the accusations of McCarthyism. The man overseeing plans for the Bay of Pigs invasion was Richard M. Bissell, Jr., the CIA's deputy director. Putting together a special group known as the 5412 Committee, he assembled a number of other agents to aid him in the plot, many of whom had worked on the 1954 Guatemalan coup 6 years before. These included David Phillips, Jerry Droller and E. Howard Hunt. Bissell placed Cha in charge of liaising with the anti-Castro segments of the Cuban American community living in the United States, and asked Hunt to fashion a government in exile which the CIA would effectively control. Hunt proceeded to travel to Havana, the capital city of Cuba, where he spoke with Cubans from various different backgrounds and discovered a brothel through the Mercedes-Benz agency. Returning to the U.S., he informed the Cuban Americans whom he was liaising with that they would have to move their base of operations from Florida to Mexico City, because the State Department refused to permit the training of a militia on U.S. soil. Although unhappy with the news, they conceded to the order. Eisenhower's approval. On March 17, 1960, the CIA put forward their plan for the overthrow of Castro's administration to the U.S. National Security Council, where it was given the support of U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The stated first objective of the plan was to bring about the replacement of the Castro regime with one more devoted to the true interests of the Cuban people and more acceptable to the U.S. in such a manner to avoid any appearance of U.S. intervention. On August 18, 1960, Eisenhower approved a budget of $13 million for the operation. By October 31, 1960, most guerrilla infiltrations and supply drops directed by the CIA into Cuba had failed, and developments of further guerrilla strategies were replaced by plans to mount an initial amphibious assault, with a minimum of 1,500 men. On November 18, 1960, Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell first briefed President-elect John Kennedy on the outlined plans. Having experience in actions such as the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'état copyright tat, Dulles was confident that the CIA was capable of overthrowing the Cuban government as led by Prime Minister Fidel Castro since February 16, 1959. On November 29, 1960, President Eisenhower met with the chiefs of the CIA, Defense, State and Treasury departments to discuss the new concept. No objections were expressed, and Eisenhower approved the plans, with the intention of persuading John Kennedy of their merit. On December 8, 1960, Bissell presented outline plans to the special group while declining to commit details to written records. Further development of the plans continued, and on January 4, 1961 they consisted of an intention to carry out a lodgment by 750 men at an undisclosed site in Cuba, supported by considerable air power. Meanwhile, in the United States presidential election, 1960, both main candidates, Richard Nixon of the Republican Party and John F. Kennedy of the Democratic Party, campaigned on the issue of Cuba, both taking a hardline stance on Castro. Nixon who was then Vice President sent a military aide to Dulles to ask how the planned invasion was progressing. He believed that it was taking too long, considering the swift preparation of the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'état. Nixon insisted that Kennedy should not be informed of the military plans, which Dulles conceded to. On January 28, 1961, President Kennedy was briefed, together with all the major departments, on the latest plan that involved 1,000 men to be landed in a ship-borne invasion at Trinidad, Cuba, about 270 km southeast of Havana, at the foothills of the Escambray Mountains in Sancti Spiritus Province. Kennedy authorized the active departments to continue, and to report progress. Trinidad had good port facilities, it was closer to many existing counter-revolutionary activities, it had an easily defensible beachhead, and it offered an escape route into the Escambray Mountains. When that scheme was subsequently rejected by the State Department, the CIA went on to propose an alternative plan. On April 4, 1961, President Kennedy then approved the Bay of Pigs plan, because it had an airfield that would not need to be extended to handle bomber operations, it was farther away from large groups of civilians than the Trinidad plan, and it was less noisy militarily, which would make any future denial of direct U.S. involvement more plausible. The invasion landing area was changed to beaches bordering the Baja de Cochinos in Las Villas Province, 150 km southeast of Havana, and east of the Zapata Peninsula. The landings were to take place at Playa Giracubden, Playa Larga, and Caleta Buena Inlet. In March 1961, the CIA helped Cuban exiles in Miami to create the Cuban Revolutionary Council, chaired by José Copyright Myra Cubed Cardona, former Prime Minister of Cuba in January 1959. Cardona became the de facto leader-in-waiting of the intended post-invasion Cuban government. Training. In April 1960, the CIA began to recruit anti-Castro Cuban exiles in the Miami area. Until July 1960, assessment and training was carried out on USEP Island and at various other facilities in South Florida, such as Homestead AFB. Specialist guerrilla training took place at Fort Gulick, Panama and at Fort Clayton, Panama. For the increasing ranks of recruits, infantry training was carried out at a CIA-run base near Retali in the Sierra Madre on the Pacific coast of Guatemala. The exiles group named themselves Brigade 2506. In summer 1960, an airfield was constructed near Retali, Guatemala. Gunnery and flight training of Brigade 2506 aircrews was carried out by personnel from Alabama ANG, using at least 6 Douglas B-26 Invaders in the markings of Feritza or copyright Reguate Multica, legitimate delivery of those to FAG being delayed by about 6 months. An additional 26 B-26s were obtained from U.S. military stocks, sanitized at Field 3 to obscure their origins, and about 20 of them were converted for offensive operations by removal of defensive armament, standardization of the 8-gun nose, addition of underwing drop tanks and rocket racks. Paratroop training was at a base nicknamed Garapatenango, near Quetzaltenango, Guatemala. Training for boat handling and amphibious landings took place at Weeks Island, Puerto Rico. Tank training took place at Fort Knox, Kentucky and Fort Benning, Georgia. Underwater demolition and infiltration training took place at Belle Chase near New Orleans. In November 1960, the Retali recruits took part in quelling an officers' rebellion in Guatemala, in addition to the intervention of the U.S. Navy. The CIA delivered people, supplies, and arms from Florida to all the bases at night, using Douglas C-54 transports. On April 9, 1961, Brigade 2506 personnel, ships, and aircraft started transferring from Guatemala to Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua. Curtiss C-46s were also used for transport between Retali and a CIA base at Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua. Facilities and limited logistical assistance were provided by the governments of General Miguel Adaguerres Fuentes in Guatemala, and General Luis Somoza Debayle in Nicaragua, but no military personnel or equipment of those nations were directly employed in the conflict. Both governments later received military training and equipment, including some of the CIA's remaining B-26s. In early 1961, Cuba's army possessed Soviet-designed T-34 medium tanks, IS-2 heavy tanks, Su-100 tank destroyers, 122 mm howitzers, other artillery and small arms, plus Italian 105 mm howitzers. The Cuban Air Force armed inventory included Douglas B-26 Invader light bombers, Hawker Sea Fury fighters, and Lockheed T-33 jets, all remaining from the Feritza or copyright Reed L. Ijar copyright RCITO de Cuba, the Cuban Air Force of the Batista government. Anticipating an invasion, Che Guevara stressed the importance of an armed civilian populace, stating all the Cuban people must become a guerrilla army, each and every Cuban must learn to handle and if necessary use firearms in defense of the nation. Participant, S. U.S. government personnel. Recruiting of Cuban exiles in Miami was organized by CIA staff officers E. Howard Hunt and Jerry Droller. Detailed planning, training and military operations were conducted by Jacob Esterline, Colonel Jack Hawkins and Colonel Stanley W. Bealey under the direction of Richard Bizzell, and his deputy Tracy Barnes. Cuban government personnel. Already, Fidel Castro was known as, and addressed as, the Commander-in-Chief of Cuban Armed Forces, with a nominal base at Point 1 in Havana. In early April 1961, his brother Raul Castro was assigned command of forces in the east, based in Santiago de Cuba. Che Guevara commanded western forces, based in Pinar del Rio. Major Juan Amidabos commanded forces in the central provinces, based in Santa Clara. Raul Cabello Morales was head of the Air Force. Sergio Del Valle copyright Nez was director of headquarters operations at Point 1. Efigenio Emiagiras was the head of the Revolutionary National Police. Ramiro Valde Copyright S. Mena Copyrightendes was Minister of the Interior and head of G2. His deputy was Comandante Manuel Pia ± Losada, also known as Barbaroja. Captain Jose Copyright Rama Cubden Fernandez was head of the School of Militia Leaders at Matanzas. Other commanders of units during the conflict included Major Raul Mena Copyrightendes Tomasevic, Major Filiberto Oliveira Moya, Major Rina Copyright de los Santos, Major Augusto Martinez Sanchez, Major Far Copyright Lex Duke, Major Pedro Mirat, Major Flavio Bravo, Major Antonio Lusa Cubden, Captain Orlando Pupo Pena, Captain Victor Drake, Captain Emilio Aragona Copyright S, Captain Angel Fernandez Vila, Arnaldo Ochoa, Orlando Rodriguez Puerta. Soviet-trained Spanish advisors were brought to Cuba from Eastern Bloc countries. These advisors had held high staff positions in the Soviet armies during World War II, and became known as Hispano-Soviets, having long resided in the Soviet Union. The most senior of these were the Spanish communist veterans of the Spanish Civil War, Francisco Sayutet de Miguel, Enrique Lastra, and Cuban-born Alberto Bea. Sayutet de Miguel was an advisor to forces in the central provinces. The role of other Soviet agents at the time is uncertain, but some of them acquired greater fame later. For example, two KGB colonels, Vadim Koshurgin and Viktor Simonov, were first sighted in Cuba in about September 1959. Prior warnings of invasion, the Cuban security apparatus knew the invasion was coming, via their secret intelligence network, as well as loose talk by members of the Brigade, some of which was heard in Miami, and was repeated in U.S. and foreign newspaper reports. Nevertheless, days before the invasion, multiple acts of sabotage were carried out, such as the El Encanto fire, an arson attack in a department store in Havana on April 13, that killed one shop worker. The Cuban government also had been warned by senior KGB agents Osvaldo Zar Nchez Cabrera and Aragon, who died violently before and after the invasion, respectively. The general Cuban population was not well informed, except for CIA-funded Radio Swan. As of May 1960, almost all means of public communication were in the government's hands. On April 29, 2000, a Washington Post article, Soviets' New Date of Cuba Attack, reported that the CIA had information indicating that the Soviet Union knew the invasion was going to take place, and did not inform Kennedy. On April 13, 1961, Radio Moscow broadcast an English-language newscast, predicting the invasion in a plot hatched by the CIA using paid criminals within a week. The invasion took place 4 days later. David Ormsby Gore, British ambassador to the U.S., stated that British intelligence analysis, as made available to the CIA, indicated that the Cuban people were predominantly behind Castro, and that there was no likelihood of mass defections or insurrections. Prelude to invasion, air attacks on airfields. During the night of 14/April 15, a diversionary landing was planned near Baracoa, Orient Province, by about 164 Cuban exiles commanded by Higinio Nino Diaz. Their mothership, named La Playa or Santa Ana, had sailed from Key West under a Costa Rican ensign. Several U.S. Navy destroyers were stationed offshore near Guantanamo Bay to give the appearance of an impending invasion fleet. The reconnaissance boats turned back to the ship after their crews detected activities by Cuban militia forces along the coastline. As a result of those activities, at daybreak, a Cuban Air Force reconnaissance sortie over the Baracoa area was launched from Santiago de Cuba. That was a FART-33, piloted by Lieutenant Orestes Acosta, and it crashed fatally into the sea. On April 17, his name was falsely quoted as a defector among the disinformation circulating in Miami. On April 15, 1961, at about 06:00 Cuba local time, 8 Douglas B-26B Invader bombers in 3 groups simultaneously attacked 3 Cuban airfields at San Antonio de los Ballplas and at Ciudad Libertad, both near Havana, plus the Antonio Maceo International Airport at Santiago de Cuba. The B-26s had been prepared by the CIA on behalf of Brigade 2506, and had been painted with the false flag markings of the FAR, the Air Force of the Cuban government. Each was armed with bombs, rockets and machine guns. They had flown from Puerto Cabezas in Nicaragua, and were crewed by exiled Cuban pilots and navigators of the self-styled Fuerza or Copyright Reader Liberación Cubana. The purpose of the action was reportedly to destroy most or all of the armed aircraft of the FAR in preparation for the main invasion. At Santiago, the two attackers destroyed a C-47 transport, a PBY Catalina flying boat, two B-26s and a civilian DC-3 plus various other civilian aircraft. At San Antonio, the three attackers destroyed three FAR B-26s, one Sea Fury and one T-33, and one attacker diverted to Grand Cayman due to low usable fuel. At Ciudad Libertad, the three attackers destroyed only non-operational aircraft such as two P-47 Thunderbolts. One of those attackers was damaged by anti-aircraft fire, and ditched about 50 km north of Cuba, with the loss of its crew Daniel Fernandez Mon and Gaston Parr copyright res. Its companion B-26, also damaged, continued north and landed at Boca Chica Field, Florida. The crew, Jose copyright Crespo and Lorenzo Parr copyright res Lorenzo, were granted political asylum, and made their way back to Nicaragua the next day via Miami and the daily CIA C-54 flight from Opa-locka Airport to Puerto Cabezas Airport. Their B-26, purposely numbered 933, the same as at least two other B-26s that day for disinformation reasons, was held until late on April 17. Deception flight, about 90 minutes after the 8 B-26s had taken off from Puerto Cabezas to attack Cuban airfields, another B-26 departed on a deception flight that took it close to Cuba but headed north towards Florida. Like the bomber groups, it carried false FAR markings and the same number 933 as painted on at least two of the others. Before departure, the cowling from one of the aircraft's two engines was removed by CIA personnel, fired upon, then reinstalled to give the false appearance that the aircraft had taken ground fire at some point during its flight. At a safe distance north of Cuba, the pilot feathered the engine with the pre-installed bullet holes in the cowling, radioed a mayday call, and requested immediate permission to land at Miami International Airport. The pilot was Mario Zara ±Iga, formerly of the FAEC, and after landing he masqueraded as Juan Garcia, and publicly claimed that three colleagues had also defected from the FAR. The next day he was granted political asylum, and that night he returned to Puerto Cabezas via Opa-locka. Reactions. At 10:30 a.m. on April 15 at the United Nations, the Cuban Foreign Minister Raúl Roa attempted to accuse the U.S. of aggressive air attacks against Cuba, and that afternoon formally tabled a motion to the Political Committee of the UN General Assembly. In response, U.S. Ambassador to the UN Adlai Stevenson stated that U.S. armed forces would not under any conditions intervene in Cuba, and that the U.S. would do everything in its power to ensure that no U.S. citizens would participate in actions against Cuba. He also stated that Cuban defectors had carried out the attacks that day, and he presented a UPI wire photo of Zara ±Iga's B-26 in Cuban markings at Miami Airport. Stevenson was later embarrassed to realize that the CIA had lied to him and to Secretary of State Dean Rusk. President Kennedy supported the statement made by Stevenson. "I have emphasized before that this was a struggle of Cuban patriots against a Cuban dictator. While we could not be expected to hide our sympathies, we made it repeatedly clear that the armed forces of this country would not intervene in any way." On April 15, the National Police, led by Efigênio Amiagiras, started the process of arresting thousands of suspected anti-revolutionary individuals, and detaining them in provisional locations such as the Karl Marx Theater, the Motive Fortaleza de la Cabana and the Principe Castle all in Havana, and the baseball park in Matanzas. Phony war. On the night of 15/April 16, the Nino Diaz group failed in a second attempted diversionary landing at a fresh location near Baracoa. On April 16, Merado Leon, Jose Leon, and 14 others staged an armed uprising at Los Ulises estate in Las Villas, with only 4 surviving. Lenel Martinez and 3 others took to the countryside. Following the airstrikes on airfields on April 15, 1961, the FAR managed to prepare for armed action at least 4 T-33s, 4 Sea Furies and 5 or 6 B-26s. All three types were armed with machine guns for air-to-air combat and for strafing of ships and ground targets. CIA planners had failed to discover that the U.S.-supplied T-33 jets had long been armed with M3 machine guns. The three types could also carry bombs, for attacks against ships and tanks. No additional airstrikes against Cuban airfields and aircraft were specifically planned before April 17, because B-26 pilots' exaggerated claims gave the CIA false confidence in the success of the 15 April attacks, until U-2 reconnaissance photos on April 16 showed otherwise. Late on April 16, President Kennedy ordered cancellation of further airfield strikes planned for dawn on April 17, to attempt plausible deniability of U.S. direct involvement. Late on April 16, the CIA Brigade 2506 invasion fleet converged on Rendezvous Point Zulu, about 65 kilometers south of Cuba, having sailed from Puerto Cabezas in Nicaragua where they had been loaded with troops and other materiel, after loading arms and supplies at New Orleans. The U.S. Navy operation was codenamed Bumpy Road, having been changed from Cross Patch on April 1, 1961. The fleet, labeled the Cuban Expeditionary Force, included 5 2,400-ton freighter ships chartered by the CIA from the Garcia Line, and subsequently outfitted with anti-aircraft guns. 4 of the freighters, Houston, Rayo Escondido, Caribe, and Atla Ntico, were planned to transport about 1,400 troops in 7 battalions of troops and armaments near to the invasion beaches. The 5th freighter, Lake Charles, was loaded with follow-up supplies and some Operation 40 infiltration personnel. The freighters sailed under Liberian ensigns. Accompanying them were 2 LCIs outfitted with heavy armament at Key West. The LCIs were Blogger and Barbara J., sailing under Nicaraguan ensigns. After exercises and training at Beeks Island, the CEF ships were individually escorted to Point Zulu by U.S. Navy destroyers Ussa Back, Ussa Beale, Ussa Conway, Ussa Coney, Ussa Eaton, Ussa Murray, Ussa Wooler. U.S. Navy Task Group 81.8 had already assembled off the Cayman Islands, commanded by Rear Admiral John E. Clark and board aircraft carrier Ussa Essex, plus helicopter assault carrier Ussa Boxer, destroyers Ussa Hank, Ussa John W. Weeks, Ussa Purdy, Ussa Wren, and submarines Ussa Cobbler and Ussa Threadfin. Command and control ship Ussa Northampton and carrier Ussa Shangri-La were also reportedly active in the Caribbean at the time. Ussa San Marcos was a landing ship dock that carried 3 LCUs and 4 LCVPs. San Marcos had sailed from Beeks Island. At Point Zulu, the 7 CEF ships sailed north without the USN escorts, except for San Marcos that continued until the 7 landing craft were unloaded when just outside the 5 km Cuban territorial limit. Invasion Day, during the night of 16/April 17, a mock diversionary landing was organized by CIA operatives near Baja Honda, Pinar del Rio province. A flotilla containing equipment that broadcast sounds and other effects of a ship-an invasion landing. That was the source of Cuban reports that briefly lured Fidel Castro away from the Bay of Pigs battlefront area. At about 00:00 on April 17, 1961, the 2 CIA LCIs Blogger and Barbara J., each with a CIA operations officer and an underwater demolition team of 5 frogmen, entered the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba. They headed a force of 4 transport ships carrying about 1,400 Cuban exile ground troops of Brigade 2506, plus tanks and other vehicles in the landing craft. At about 01:00, the Blogger, as the battlefield command ship, directed the principal landing at Playa Giracuden, led by the frogmen and rubber boats followed by troops from Caribe and small aluminium boats, then LCVPs and LCUs. The Barbara J., leading Houston, similarly landed troops 35 km further northwest at Playa Larga, using small fiberglass boats. Unloading troops at night was delayed, due to engine failures and boats damaged by unforeseen coral reefs. the few militia in the area succeeded in warning Cuban armed forces via radio soon after the first landing, before the invaders overcame their token resistance. At daybreak at about 06:30, 3 FARC Furies, 1 B-26 bomber and 2 Lockheed T-33 fighter jets started attacking those CEF ships still unloading troops. At about 06:50 and 8 kilometers south of Playa Larga, Houston was damaged by several rockets from a Sea Fury and a T-33, and about 2 hours later Captain Lewis Morse intentionally beached it on the western side of the bay. About 270 troops had been unloaded, but about 180 survivors who struggled ashore were incapable of taking part in further action because of the loss of most of their weapons and equipment. At about 07:00, 2 invading FAL-B-26s attacked and sank the Cuban Navy patrol escort ship El Bahia at Nueva Gerona on the Isle of Pines. They then proceeded to Guerra-Cuba to join 2 other B-26s to attack Cuban ground troops and provide distraction air cover for the paratroop C-46s and the CEF ships under air attack. At about 07:30, 5 C-46 and 1 C-54 transport aircraft dropped 177 paratroops from the Parachute Battalion of Brigade 2506 in an action code-named Operation Falcon. About 30 men, plus heavy equipment, were dropped south of Australia's sugar mill on the road to Palpite and Playa Larga, but the equipment was lost in the swamps, and the troops failed to block the road. Other troops were dropped at San Blas, at Jocuma between Covadonga and San Blas, and at Hawkwitas between Yaguaramas and San Blas. Those positions to block the roads were maintained for 2 days, reinforced by ground troops from Playa Guerra-Cuba. At about 08:30, an FARC Fury piloted by Carlos Ulloa crashed in the bay, due to stalling or anti-aircraft fire, after encountering a FAL-C-46 returning south after dropping paratroops. By 09:00, Cuban troops and militia from outside the area had started arriving at Australia's sugar mill, Covadonga and Yaguaramas. Throughout the day they were reinforced by more troops, heavy armor and T-34 tanks typically carried on flatbed trucks. At about 09:30, FARC Furies and T-33s fired rockets at the Rio Escondido, that blew up and sank about 3 kilometers south of Guerra-Cuba. At about 11:00, Premier Fidel Castro issued a statement over Cuba's nationwide network saying that the invaders, members of the exiled Cuban Revolutionary Front, have come to destroy the revolution and take away the dignity and rights of men. At about 11:00, an FAR-T-33 attacked a FAL-B-26 piloted by Macias Ferriers who then survived a crash landing on the Guerra-Cuba airfield, his navigator Eduardo Gonzalez already killed by gunfire. His companion B-26 suffered damage and diverted to Grand Cayman Island. Pilot Mario Zara ± eager and navigator Oscar Vega returned to Puerto Cabezas via CIA C-54 on April 18. By about 11:00, the 2 remaining freighters Carib and Atla NTICO, and the CIA LCIs and LCUs, started retreating south to international waters, but still pursued by FAR aircraft. At about 12:00, an FAR-B-26 exploded due to heavy anti-aircraft fire from Blogar, and pilot Luis Silva Tablada and his crew of 3 were lost. By 12:00, hundreds of militia cadets from Matanzas had secured Palpite, and cautiously advanced on foot south towards Playa Larga, suffering many casualties during attacks by FAL-B-26s. By dusk, other Cuban ground forces were gradually advancing southward from Covadonga and southwest from Yaguaramas towards San Blas, and westward along coastal tracks from Cienfuegos towards Guerra-Cuba, all without heavy weapons or armor. 3 FAL-B-26s were shot down by FAR-T-33s, with the loss of pilots Raul Vianello, Jose Copyright Crespo, Osvaldo Piedra and navigators Lorenzo Par Copyright Rez Lorenzo and Jose Copyright Fernandez. Vianello's navigator Demetrio Par Copyright Rez bailed out and was picked up by USS Murray. Pilot Crispa N. Garcia Fernandez and navigator Juan Gonzalez Romero, in B-26 Serial 940, diverted to Boca Chica, but late that night they attempted to fly back to Puerto Cabezas in B-26 serial 933 that Crespo had flown to Boca Chica on April 15. In October 1961, the remains of the B-26 and its two crew were found in dense jungle in Nicaragua. One FAL B-26 diverted to Grand Cayman with engine failure. By 1600, Fidel Castro had arrived at the Central Australia sugar mill, joining Jose Copyright Rama Cubden Fernandez, whom he had appointed as battlefield commander before dawn that day. On April 17, 1961, Osvaldo Ramirez was captured by Castro's forces in Aromas de Villa ZQUEZ, and immediately executed. At about 21:00 on April 17, 1961, a night airstrike by three FAL B-26s on San Antonio de los Baús airfield failed, reportedly due to incompetence and bad weather. Two other B-26s had aborted the mission after takeoff. Other sources allege that heavy anti-aircraft fire scared the air crews. Invasion Day +1 April 18. By about 10:30 on April 18, Cuban troops and militia, supported by tanks, took Playa Larga after Brigade forces had fled towards Guerra Cubden in the early hours. During the day, Brigade forces retreated to San Blas along the two roads from Covadonga and Yaguaramas. By then, both Fidel Castro and Jose Copyright Rama Cubden Fernandez had relocated to that battlefront area. At about 17:00 on April 18, FAL B-26s attacked a Cuban column of 12 civilian buses leading trucks carrying tanks and other armor, moving southeast between Playa Larga and Punta Perdes. The vehicles, loaded with civilians, militia, police and soldiers, were attacked with bombs, napalm and rockets, suffering heavy casualties. The 6 B-26s were piloted by 2 CIA contract pilots plus 4 pilots and 6 navigators from Brigade 2506 Air Force. The column later reformed and advanced to Punta Perdes, about 11 km northwest of Guerra Cubden. Invasion Day +2 April 19. During the night of April 18, an FAL C-46 delivered arms and equipment to the Guerra Cubden airstrip occupied by Brigade 2506 ground forces, and took off before daybreak on April 19. The C-46 also evacuated Macias Farias, the pilot of B-26 serial 935 that had been shot down and crash-landed at Guerra Cubden on April 17. The final air attack mission comprised 5 B-26s, 4 of which were manned by American CIA contract air crews and pilots from the Alabama Air Guard. 1 FARC Fury and 2 FAR T-33s shot down 2 of these B-26s, killing 4 American airmen. Combat air patrols were flown by Douglas A-4D-2N Skyhawk jets of VA-34 Squadron operating from USS Essex, with nationality and other markings removed. Sorties were flown to reassure brigade soldiers and pilots, and to intimidate Cuban government forces without directly engaging in acts of war. Without direct air support, and short of ammunition, Brigade 2506 ground forces retreated to the beaches in the face of considerable onslaught from Cuban government artillery, tanks and infantry. Late on April 19, destroyers USS Eaton and USS Murray moved into Cochinos Bay to evacuate retreating brigade soldiers from beaches, before firing from Cuban Army tanks caused Commodore Crutchfield to order a withdrawal. Invasion Day +3 April 20. From April 19 until about April 22, sorties were flown by A-4D-2 nanoseconds to obtain visual intelligence over combat areas. Reconnaissance flights are also reported of Douglas AD-5WS of VFP-62 and or VAW-12 squadron from USS Essex or another carrier, such as USS Shangri-La that was part of the task force assembled off the Cayman Islands. On April 21, Eaton and Murray, joined on April 22 by destroyers USS Conway and USS Coney, plus submarine USS Threadfin and a CIA PBY-5A Catalina flying boat, continued to search the coastline, reefs and islands for scattered brigade survivors, about 24 to 30 being rescued. Aftermath, casualties, air crews killed in action totaled 6 from the Cuban Air Force, 10 Cuban exiles and 4 American airmen. paratrooper Eugene Herman Koch was killed in action, and the American airmen shot down were Thomas W. Ray, Leo F. Baker, Riley W. Schamberger and Wade C. Gray. In 1979, the body of Thomas Pete Ray was repatriated from Cuba. In the 1990s, the CIA admitted to his links to the agency, and awarded him the Intelligence Star. 114 Cuban exiles from Brigade 2506 were killed in action. The final toll in Cuban armed forces during the conflict was 176 killed in action. Other Cuban forces casualties were between 500 and 4,000. The airfield attacks on April 15 left 7 Cubans dead and 53 wounded. Prisoners. On April 19, 1961, at least 7 Cubans plus 2 CIA-hired U.S. citizens were executed in Pinar del Rio province, after a 2-day trial. On April 20, Humberto Sora Marin was executed at Fort Orleans de la Cabal ±, having been arrested on March 18 following infiltration into Cuba with 14 tons of explosives. His fellow conspirators Roger Leo González Corzo, Rafael Diaz Hanscom, Eufemio Fernandez, Arturo Hernández Tellesch and Manuel Lorenzo Puigmul were also executed. Between April and October 1961, hundreds of executions took place in response to the invasion. They took place at various prisons, including the Fort Orleans de la Cabal ±A and El Morro Castle. Infiltration team leaders Antonio Diaz Pu and Raimundo E. Lopez, as well as underground students Virgilio Campanaria, Alberto Tapia Romano, and more than 100 other insurgents were executed. About 1,202 Brigade 2506 members were captured, of which 9 died from asphyxiation during transfer to Havana in a closed truck. In May 1961, Fidel Castro proposed to exchange the surviving brigade prisoners for 500 large farm tractors, valued at $28 million. On September 8, 1961, 14 brigade prisoners were convicted of torture, murder and other major crimes committed in Cuba before the invasion, 5 being executed and 9 jailed for 30 years. 3 confirmed as executed were Ramon Calvino, Emilio Soler Puig and Jorge Quignon. On March 29, 1962, 1,179 men were put on trial for treason. On April 7, 1962, all were convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison. On April 14, 1962, 60 wounded and sick prisoners were freed and transported to the U.S. On December 21, 1962, Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro and James B. Donovan, a U.S. lawyer aided by Milan C. Miskovsky, a CIA legal officer, signed an agreement to exchange 1,113 prisoners for $53 million in food and medicine, sourced from private donations and from companies expecting tax concessions. On December 24, 1962, some prisoners were flown to Miami, others following on the ship African Pilot, plus about 1,000 family members also allowed to leave Cuba. On December 29, 1962, President Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline attended a welcome-back ceremony for Brigade 2506 veterans at the Orange Bowl in Miami, Florida. Political reaction. The failed invasion severely embarrassed the Kennedy administration, and made Castro wary of future U.S. intervention in Cuba. On April 21, in a State Department press conference, President Kennedy said, "There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan." Further statements, detailed discussions, are not to conceal responsibility because I'm the responsible officer of the government. In August 1961, during an economic conference of the Organization of American States in Punta del Este, Uruguay, Che Guevara sent a note to Kennedy via Richard N. Goodwin, a secretary of the White House. It said, "Thanks for Playa Guerra Cuban." Before the invasion, the revolution was weak. Now it's stronger than ever. Additionally, Guevara answered a set of questions from Leo Huberman of Monthly Review following the invasion. In one reply, Guevara was asked to explain the growing number of Cuban counter-revolutionaries and defectors from the regime, to which he replied that the repelled invasion was the climax of counter-revolution, and that afterwards such actions fell drastically to zero. In regards to the defections of some prominent figures within the Cuban government, Guevara remarked that this was because the socialist revolution left the opportunists, the ambitious, and the fearful far behind and now advances toward a new regime free of this class of vermin. As Allen Dulles later stated, CIA planners believed that once the troops were on the ground, any action required for success would be authorized to prevent failure, as Eisenhower had done in Guatemala in 1954 after the invasion looked as if it was collapsing. President Kennedy was angered with the CIA's failure, and declared he wanted to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Kennedy commented to his journalist friend Ben Bradlee, "The first advice I'm going to give my successor is to watch the generals and to avoid feeling that because they were military men their opinions on military matters were worth a damn." Later analysis, Maxwell Taylor Survey, on April 22, 1961, President Kennedy asked General Maxwell D. Taylor, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, Admiral I. Layberg and CIA Director Allen Dulles to form the Cuba Study Group, to report on the lessons to be learned from the failed operation. On June 13, General Taylor submitted the report of the Board of Inquiry to President Kennedy. The defeat was attributed to lack of early realization of the impossibility of success by covert means, inadequate aircraft, limitations of armaments, pilots and air attacks to attempt plausible deniability, and ultimately, loss of important ships and lack of ammunition. CIA report, in November 1961, CIA Inspector General Lyman B. Kirkpatrick, authored a report survey of the Cuban operation, that remained classified until 1996. Conclusions were, the CIA exceeded its capabilities in developing the project from guerrilla support to overt armed action without any plausible deniability. Failure to realistically assess risks and to adequately communicate information and decisions internally and with other government principals. Insufficient involvement of leaders of the exiles. Failure to sufficiently organize internal resistance in Cuba. Failure to competently collect and analyze intelligence about Cuban forces. Poor internal management of communications and staff. Insufficient employment of high-quality staff. Insufficient Spanish speakers, training facilities and material resources. Lack of stable policies and/or contingency plans. In spite of vigorous rebuttals by CIA management of the findings, CIA Director Allen Dulles, CIA Deputy Director Charles Cabell, and Deputy Director for Plans Richard Bissell were all forced to resign by early 1962. In later years, the CIA's behavior in the event became the prime example cited for the psychology paradigm known as groupthink syndrome. In mid-1960, CIA operative E. Howard Hunt had interviewed Cubans in Havana. In a 1997 interview with CNN, he said, "All I could find was a lot of enthusiasm for Fidel Castro. Invasion legacy in Cuba, for many Latin Americans, the Bay of Pigs invasion served to reinforce the already widely held belief that the U.S. could not be trusted, but also illustrated that they could be defeated, and encouraged political groups across the region to find ways to undermine U.S. imperialism. The invasion is often recognized as making Castro even more popular, adding nationalistic sentiments to the support for his economic policies." Following the 15th April air attacks on Cuban airfields, he declared the revolution Marxist-Leninist. After the invasion, he pursued closer relations with the Soviet Union, partly for protection, that helped pave the way for the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro was then increasingly wary of further U.S. intervention, and more opening to Soviet suggestions of placing nuclear weapons on Cuba to ensure its security. In March 2001, shortly before the 40th anniversary of the invasion, a conference took place in Havana, attended by about 60 American delegates. The conference was titled Bay of Pigs, 40 Years After, co-sponsored by the University of Havana and the U.S.-based National Security Archive. There are still yearly nationwide drills in Cuba during the Dia de la Defensa, to prepare the population for an invasion. Invasion legacy for Cuban exiles. Many who fought for the CIA in the conflict remained loyal after the event. Some Bay of Pigs veterans became officers in the U.S. Army in Vietnam, including 6 colonels, 19 lieutenant colonels, 9 majors, and 29 captains. By March 2007, about half of the brigade had died. In April 2010, the Cuban Pilots Association unveiled a monument at the Kendall-Tammy Army Executive Airport in memory of the 16 aviators for the Exal side killed during the battle. The memorial consists of an obelisk and a restored B-26 replica aircraft atop a large Cuban flag. Playa Guerra Cubed End today. Little remains of the original village, which in the 1960s was small and remote. It is still remote, with just a single road to the village and out again, but it has grown markedly since the invasion. Few people there today were residents at the time. The road from the north is marked by frequent memorials to the Cuban dead. There are billboards marking where invaders were rounded up and showing pictures of their being led away. Another at the entrance to the village quotes Fidel Castro's comment that the conflict was the first defeat of Yankee imperialism. A two-room museum, with American aircraft and other military equipment outside, shows pictures, arms and maps of the attack and photos of Cuban soldiers who died. Billboards and other material also remember the counter-revolutionary forces. See also: Cuba-United States relations, Operation Northwoods, Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuban Project, Cuban Revolution, War Against the Bandits, Guantanamo Bay, Operation Ortsac, Special Activities Division, Swan Islands, United States embargo against Cuba, explanatory notes. References, footnotes. Bibliography. External links: Bay of Pigs, Invasion and Aftermath, a slideshow by Life magazine, a film clip, Cuba invaded. Foes of Castro open offensive, 196,119 inches is available for free download at the Internet Archive. More